Hello everyone, myself Alfonso Jochen. I'm practicing as an environmental law consultant. Today we'll be discussing the module on biodiversity. So the module primarily deals with the international and the national legal framework on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. We will be also focusing on three areas, particularly the knowledge and the practices of indigenous and local communities relating to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, and biodiversity inclusive environmental impact assessment, and thirdly we'll be focusing on biosafety and regulations relating to genetically modified organisms or living modified organisms. So before we begin, let's discuss what is biodiversity. So as the name itself indicates, biodiversity is a diversity or variability in bios, that is, the living organisms. So it has three components mainly. One is ecosystem diversity, the other one is species diversity, and the last one is genetic diversity. So what is ecosystem diversity? Ecosystem diversity simply signifies the diversity in ecosystem. For instance, we have the mountain ecosystems, we have the forest ecosystem, we have marine and coastal ecosystems. So the diversity of the ecosystem is what is ecosystem diversity is, and within the ecosystem, as all of us know, there are different kinds of plants, animals and microorganisms. This is what species diversity is. And as also we know, within the species there are different kinds of varieties of plants. For instance, let's say take the example of rice. We have the basmati, which is a fragrant rice variety. We have the brown rice, we have the white rice, we have certain traditional varieties of rice which have medicinal uses. So the different kinds of species, the diversity within species is called genetic diversity. So these are the three important components, three components of biological diversity. That's the ecosystem diversity, the species diversity and genetic diversity. Now let's discuss how the biodiversity, like this definition of biodiversity, has found its place in a convention called Convention on Biological Diversity, which was adopted in 1992 by in Rio de Janeiro, among the two other conventions on different aspects of environment. So how was the environment, nature, biodiversity, which has been an integral part of life of the human beings, and the use of the biodiversity components, which have been in practice from time immemorial, found its place in 1992 in the CBD, that is the Convention on Biodiversity. And why were the state parties coming together and adopting a convention which will deal with measures for conservation, measures for protecting different types of biodiversity that we have already discussed, and for measures for sustainably using these components. It has, as all of you would have known, the Brundtland report and unsustainable practices, unsustainable ways of development, and also different anthropological pressures to biodiversity due to different reasons like population abundance, population growth, industrial practices, and also intense agriculture practices like monoculture, development projects like mining, dams, etc. has a huge impact on biodiversity loss. And there have been a style that was different from a sustainable way of lifestyle, but developing was an unsustainable practice of extraction of biodiversity components from the biodiversity, which is leading to the biodiversity loss. So in 1992, the nation states gathered together in Rio and passed this Convention on Biodiversity so as to ensure conservation of biodiversity and conservation, sustainable use of its components, and another thing is fair and equitable sharing of sharing of benefits from the utilization of bioresources. So this aspect, the third aspect, is the action benefit sharing, which we will be discussing in another module, but In this module, we will be covering conservation of biodiversity and sustainable use of biodiversity. In CBD, let's see in which all provisions this conservation and sustainable use has have found its place. It starts the Article 6, Article 7, Article 8, Article 9 and Article 10 of CBD directly deal with conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Article 6 is more or less like a very general provision dealing with it. It says that the states who are parties to this convention, they have an obligation to undertake and develop national strategies, national action plans, programs for conservation and sustainable use, and they also have an obligation to integrate these concepts of conservation and sustainable use into the already existing policies and regulations and programs and plans, etc. So this is Article 6 all about, and let's see how India has responded to this Convention on Biological Diversity. As the national legislation that India has enacted because of its obligation as a contracting party to the Convention on Biodiversity is the Biological Diversity Act of 2002. Most of the provisions in Article 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 have found its place in our Biological Diversity Act also. So India has also developed a national biodiversity action plan that was passed and adopted and passed in 2008, which was a result of a series of public consultation and also a result of technical report that's called Securing India's Future, which unfortunately did not become the national strategy and biodiversity action plan, but it became a technical report, and the national biodiversity action plan was adopted in 2008 after these series of consultation. This action plan also refers a lot to the conservation and sustainable use that is already there in the articles of the CBD and also the provisions of Biological Diversity Act. So let's see what is the conservation aspects and what are the articles that relate to conservation say about conservation and what the measures that are required for conservation within CBD. So Article 8 and Article 9 deals with in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. In situ conservation is nothing but conservation of biodiversity in its ecosystem, in its natural habitats, like ecosystems, conservation of ecosystems as ecosystems, and conservation of natural habitats. So for instance, we have national parks, we have sanctuaries, we also have zoos, we have botanical gardens, we have gene banks. What's the difference between these two conservation efforts? One is conservation in its natural environment. So you will have your ecosystem like a national park. For example, you will have the Periyar National Park being protected and managed as in Periyar in its natural environment. But let's say we also have zoos in which tigers are kept and protected. That's something called ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is conservation outside the natural habitats of the species or natural habitat. For instance, we have botanical gardens wherein a lot of species of plants are kept and protected and grown outside their natural environment. We also have gene banks where the seed or the genetic component of particular species will be preserved and conserved and kept so that, I mean, especially these genes that collect a lot of diverse species and species that are in the verge of extinction or are threatened. So a lot of species that are threatened or on verge of extinction are conserved through ex situ methods. But CBD says that in situ method of conservation is the primary conservation that need to be done, and even if you are protecting species in ex situ, the ex situ protection methods should be in those countries where the plants are or the species or the biodiversity, biological resources are in the country of origin. For instance, if say if brinjal India is a country of origin of the brinjal, then your ex situ methods of conservation should be within India itself, or a variety whose origin is primarily in India, it should be in India. So in situ conservation is conservation within the natural environment, and ex situ conservation is outside the natural environment. In situ conservation is also with respect to cultivated and domesticated species. For instance, you have rice varieties or chilies, which really don't, I mean, chilies, their country of origin is not India, but if you see Andhra chilies have developed a distinct characteristic of its own, then we can call them, and that conservation as an in situ conservation itself, in where they have developed the surroundings, in where they have developed their distinct properties, it's also a method of conservation, in situ conservation.